Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual book talk, Missionary Diplomacy, Religion and 19th-Century American Foreign Relations with Dr. Emily Conroy-Krutz. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, civic, and cultural dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive, which has more than 110,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in the congregational story. Please check our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Emily Conroy-Krutz is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University. She is the author of Christian Imperialism, as well as Missionary Diplomacy.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Hi, everyone. It is lovely to see you all today. So the research for this book, Missionary Diplomacy, emerged out of some of the lingering questions I had after I finished my first book, Christian Imperialism. And Christian Imperialism was looking at the ways that American Protestants in roughly the first half of the 19th century were thinking about empire and about how those ideas were shaped by and in turn shaped foreign missions, mainly through the ABCFM, which Congregational Library folks might know. Congregational Library has a fantastic collection of ABCFM papers. And so that book was looking at the ABCFM in India, Liberia, the Cherokee Nation, Singapore, and Hawaii. But coming out of that project, one of the things that I was wondering was, how did these ideas about empire and the place of the US in the world translate into policy in practice? So I knew from my first book that missionaries were traveling all over the globe in the first decades of the 19th century, and that they and their supporters had very strong opinions about what the United States ought to be doing in the world. But I wanted to dig deeper and see how, when, and where those opinions shaped how the government was acting. I was interested in tracing the ways that American diplomacy and Protestant missions grew up alongside one another over the course of the 19th century. And so the book then sets out to look at the development of the foreign mission movement alongside and in conversation with the development of the US State Department over the course of the 19th century. So I'll just in brief give you a sense of the argument of the book, and then we can sort of talk through a little bit sort of how the argument develops over the course of the book. I'll share with you some of my favorite stories, and then we'll have time for some Q&A and further conversation. So in brief, the book argues that missionaries played a key role in shaping American foreign policy over the course of the 19th century, and that understanding this dynamic helps to set the stage for the importance of religion to American diplomacy throughout US history in the 19th century and indeed in the 20th and the 21st, since that's where we are now. So over the course of the book, I look at the ways that sort of missionaries work to establish themselves as experts on the world who could and should advise the US government on how it should respond to world issues, the ways that missionaries served and worked for the US government, mostly through the consular system or as translators and advisors, sometimes at really key moments, including the creation of treaties, how missionaries raised questions about the nature of citizenship and what protections the US government needed to provide for Americans abroad, and how their activities would force the government to act in places and in ways that it would not have done otherwise, including intervening in humanitarian crises. And looking at maps is going to help us get some idea of why they were able to do this and why missionaries played such a key and sometimes unseen role in American foreign relations. So we can start with a map from 1830, and this can give you a sense of sort of where missionaries and consulates are from the US in around 1830. And so the dots there are embassies, the sort of open circles are US consulates, and there's little crosses there that show us where Protestant missionary stations are around the world. And if you'll see from 1830 into 1860, there's a lot of growth in both the mission movement and in the consular system's footprint, sort of where folks are. But what you're also going to notice here is that there's a geographic distinction. Missionaries and diplomats are paying attention to different kinds of places. So Europe matters a lot to the government. Latin America matters a lot to the government. And Protestant missionaries are looking at the so-called heathen world of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific Islands. This is going to have a really important effect on how US foreign relations develops over the course of the century, because missionaries are able then to position themselves as the American experts on the regions of the world where they lived. And in part, they do this through the publication of what they call Missionary Intelligence. This is texts that explain the world to America and America to the world. And so once the State Department becomes interested in these regions, sometimes because missionaries insist that the US Department of State becomes interested in those regions, it's the missionaries who are really well positioned to explain and to influence the government with their ideas, their priorities, and their interests. Sometimes they will do this in an official capacity, working as consuls, working as interpreters, in a few cases, even as US ministers to particular places. And over the course of the book, I trace the ways that this influence will play out in discussions about citizenship, extraterritoriality, institution building, humanitarianism, and more in the century between the 1810s and 1924. And if we want to sort of stay on the map for one more second and look at an inset here from 1860, we can see this is looking in here on sort of the Eastern Mediterranean region to give you a little bit of a better sense of what's going on the ground, because this is one of these places where the Ottoman Empire is a space that both missionaries and the US government are going to be interested in. But we see that even with that, there's a fair amount of distinction and difference between specific spots where the missionaries are and where the US government is. You'll see sort of the overlap of a lot of dots there, sort of in the upper left of the map, right? That is sort of where we have, that's Constantinople, I believe. So we've got both missions and government officials sort of in that spot, and yet lots of crosses that are a significant distance from the US minister, where we've got sort of missionaries kind of on their own. And the implications of this, and this kind of thing will sort of multiply across the globe, is that if and when American missionaries get in trouble, it can be hard for them to get help from the state. So what we're going to see over the course of the 19th century is missionaries demanding a larger US presence abroad, sometimes even asking for particular sympathetic individuals to serve in those roles, sometimes serving in those roles themselves. And over the course of the century, as a result, really shaping American foreign relations. So how do I do this in the book? I'll sort of talk you through a little bit the outline here. The book is divided into 3 parts, the first of which I call Missionary Intelligence. And this looks at those expertise claims in 2 major chapters, the first of which looks at John Quincy Adams, who we see here on the left, in his encounters with missionaries over the course of his career. And the second one looking at missionary publications on a wide range of subjects over the course of the century. And so the fostering of an audience who is going to be trusting the missionaries and turning to missionaries for information about the world. The real thing I try to get at in part 1 is how missionaries come to position themselves as the experts who could explain the world to Americans. These are prolific writers in multiple genres. And what's really striking, if we look at someone like John Quincy Adams, who is probably the most globally informed individual in the US in the first half of the 19th century, right? Even Adams is reading missionary material. Going through his diary, one thing really stood out to me was that he's encountering missionaries, he's meeting them, he's listening to their sermons, he's reading their books. He is not always a fan of theirs, and he does not always agree with what they have to say, but their writing and their arguments can, in fact, shape what he comes to understand about the world for certain regions. And this really sort of gets at that geography question we were just looking at in the slides before. The question of so who is where and when they're there. Much of Adams' diplomacy was focused on Europe and Latin America. And the missionaries become really important conversation partners when it comes to Asia. At the point in Adams's career, when he starts thinking about China, it's the missionaries he's going to be in conversation with as he's shaping his understanding of what the US should be doing going into China in the 1840s. And this is an early example of something that I explore throughout the book. There are several key government figures who will turn to missionaries for information about key places around the world at the moments when those places suddenly become important. Teddy Roosevelt is another important figure. Woodrow Wilson is another important figure in these developments. And so this missionary intelligence that Adams and others are reading, this comes in many forms: geography text, ethnographic writings, historical writings, sociological writings, scientific writings, and things like this. It is surprisingly well accepted by both the public and the government, especially in the earlier part of the 19th century. And what is really clear as we sort of start looking at this missionary intelligence is that, of course, one audience for these books is going to be folks who are interested in missions, who sort of care about the missionaries and are committed to their evangelical cause. But it's going much farther than that as well. Even if you're not interested in missionaries as such, you're still going to be encountering missionary intelligence for much of the 19th century, simply because they are the Americans writing on these places. And so the book we can see here on the right side of the screen, The Middle Kingdom, by Samuel Wells Williams, is one of sort of our big examples of this. It's a major American text on China that is written by a missionary. It is written is published in part to raise money for a missionary hospital. And that missionary identity of the author is largely buried through the book that positions itself really as sort of an expert guide to the history and culture of China. So that first book, first part of the book gets us set up in understanding how missionaries are claiming themselves as experts. And part two of the book really gets us into kind of the meat of this story and what I call Missionary Troubles. These chapters hop around the globe, focusing on a few key themes, including citizenship, the consular service, violence against missionaries, and missionary troublemaking, which is some of the language that we see the State Department using over the course of the century is sort of missionary troubles that are emerging time and time again. So as we think about this, I also talk here about how we can think about sort of the religious and secular work that missionaries are doing in this context. So as we think about missionary troubles, one of the things that's really important to understand is that the 19th century is a period in which the meaning of citizenship is being worked out. And missionaries are going to be a really important part of how this works out in the international stage. What rights citizens have abroad is not always clear, nor is it always clear who gets to claim those rights of citizenship. And so missionaries, as they're going out into the world in this period, really expecting to spend their entire lives outside of the United States once they leave, coming back for kind of furlough trips and things like that. But they are really now identifying as the expectation is, right, they're going to be away for decades. They insist that still they are US citizens who deserve the protection of the state to go about what they call their legitimate business. And that includes building schools, hospitals, selling books, and of course, itinerating and proselytizing. And they have to make this claim over and over again precisely because their ability to do it is challenged in different times and places. And so as I go through the different chapters in this section, you'll meet some of the individuals you can see up here on the slide as they sort of come into conflict with foreign governments and have to sort of call on the US to to step in and help them. One of the early stories we can look at here happens in Hawaii. And it sort of is the result of a conflict between the French and the Hawaiian government. In the 1830s, a ship arrives, l'Artemis, and on it, there is a French captain who is carrying a new treaty that he wants the Hawaiian government to sign with France. And what he sort of threatens is that if you don't sign, right, we are going to attack the islands. He makes a promise of safety to the American consul in Hawaii, but says that sort of all Americans will be safe except for the missionaries. Because, as the captain explained, missionaries had, in fact, abandoned their ability to be seen as U.S. citizens. The missionaries had caused the conflict with between the Hawaiians and the French in this interpretation. They were, as the captain explained, sort of inappropriately getting involved in Hawaiian politics, and they were no longer Americans. Missionaries were horrified, of course, and terrified to hear that this was how they were being seen. They would later reflect that they sort of gathered together, tried to pray, tried to sing hymns, and hope for their safety. They were very concerned that their government was not going to protect them. And so coming out of this, they demanded again and again this question of, are we citizens? Does the State Department appreciate that it has the responsibility to protect us and to protect our rights as Americans? And over and over again, they said, just as you would protect sort of any businessman, any merchant, any other American abroad. And we see in this case, and then again throughout the century, the State Department, when asked, affirms this, right? That yes, missionaries are indeed American citizens who are going out conducting legitimate business, and that business needs to be protected, and protected in important ways. The consular system is going to be the way that this works throughout most of the 19th century. The consular system is designed to promote American commerce, but in the so-called non-Christian world where these missionaries are living and doing their work, the consular system is also responsible for important diplomatic and judicial responsibilities. And so they are going to be really key to the ability of sort of Americans to, these consuls are going to be really key to the ability of Americans to sort of live and live under foreign laws, to sort of be protected from having to come into conflict with sort of locals wherever they are and things like this. And so sometimes missionaries will be serving as consuls. And our guy on the top right and the center and actually all three men in the top row, the guy on the bottom right here, all of them are missionaries who serve also in consular roles over the course of their career. David Bethune-McCarty is up there on the top right. I talk about him sort of throughout the book, but he sort of he and his family form the anchor of my prologue. Samuel Wells Williams is the guy wearing the really cool sunglasses there. He's the author of the book we just talked about, as well as a missionary and a consul. Peter Parker, in the sort of lovely oil painting in the middle there, is he's also a medical missionary, also a consul, eventually serves actually as U.S. minister to China. And then we have here on the bottom right, the gentleman in the turban, who I'd love to talk about in a little bit more detail. That is Jonas King. And I think King helps us get at a lot of these dynamics. King began his career as a missionary in Palestine and Greece, and then comes to Greece. And it's his experience in Greece that I really want to talk about here. He will be arrested multiple times and still will be the one who is called upon to serve as a U.S. consul, eventually even sort of calling on U.S. gunboats to patrol the Mediterranean in a show of support during what ends up being his final trial. He is a really interesting figure that helps us think about these dynamics of missionary trouble. And so King is an ABCFM sponsored missionary. But he is in Greece sort of alongside other American missionaries. The Episcopals and the Baptists also have Greek missions during these years. And all of the missions in Greece in the 1830s and the early 1840s into the 1850s are focused on schools, on sort of translating the scriptures into modern Greek, and distributing the Bible and other religious texts. An American diplomat would describe this work as the spread of so-called general knowledge, right? It's not sectarian evangelism. It's sort of educational and more or less secular. And so King insists that as he does this, he's not proselytizing. Now, that claim is incredibly important because proselytizing on behalf of Protestant churches was, in fact, against Greek law at the time. Greek officials, however, had a very different interpretation of the kind of work that Jonas King was doing. On no less than 3 occasions, Jonas King was charged with violating Greek laws about religion. In response, King aggressively asserted his right to religious liberty, which was also guaranteed in the Greek constitution. And he argued with the government and with his Greek detractors over various doctrinal issues and the meaning of religious freedom. And this really matters because, of course, King is not just a missionary, but he is also serving as the U.S. consul. And so these troubles begin for him in 1845. He is first charged with impious language about Mary, the Mother of God. He found, like many other Protestants, found the Greek Orthodox veneration of Mary to be idolatrous. And he would publish writings from Orthodox fathers that supported his interpretation of Christian doctrine. For this, he was charged with falsifying the testimony of the fathers, and in his characteristically bombastic responses to these charges, he received then repeated threats against his physical safety. 1847, he leaves Greece briefly for fear of attack. He returns the year later, spends a few years kind of laying low, and then by 1851 is once again distributing Protestant texts, is once again evangelizing. And it's at this point that he finds himself again in controversy. He was preaching by this point in the chapel in his own home, and both the content of what he was preaching and his goals came under question. One afternoon in March, a student who had come to worship at his home asked him to asked if he could have the ability to address the worshipers at the conclusion of the service. And so he stood in front of the crowd and criticized King for his past sermons that had gone against various dogmas of the Greek Orthodox Church. King tried to quiet him, but the crowd insisted that this young man be allowed to speak. And quite quickly, this situation escalated. The crowd refused to leave. King's wife insisted that this was a private home and they needed to go. They ignored this, continuing to kind of start to get a little bit violent, and only quieted and only left when King went upstairs and came down with the US flag in his hands, saying that not only were they in a private home, but they were in fact in the US consulate. Now, this was true. King was indeed serving as consul at the time. And he is an interesting choice for this role, kind of a weird choice for this role, precisely because of his history of conflict with the Greek government. Later, after this all resolves itself, King would tell the story in front of the US Senate, creating what one listener said was a thrill among those gathered at the glowing description of the power of the Stars and Stripes to protect an American citizen. But it was not just the flag that protected King. Within months, he would face another criminal prosecution, this time again for proselytizing and for malevolent speech against the Greek Orthodox Church. Americans hearing about this understood the case to be about religious freedom. So Rufus Anderson, the head of the ABCFM, would say the conflict was over, quote, the freedom to worship God and preach the gospel in Greece. To Anderson, Rufus King was a modern-day Martin Luther. There was the need for a much needed heroic reformer to come in and reform a corrupt church. Now, those grandiose claims would ignore the complex political factors at play, both within Greece itself and in Greco-American relations at the time. And of course, it also ignores the different definitions of religious freedom that were at work in these two national contexts. And so during the trial and the international crisis that followed, Americans and Greeks would debate the nature of religious tolerance, the importance of matters of doctrinal differences between different groups of Christians, and of course, the ability of foreign states to answer those questions for each other. And Americans also thought that these questions forced the issue of how much protection missionaries deserved or could expect from the federal government when they were overseas. The trial that followed ended with King being found guilty and sentenced to 15 days in prison, followed by a banishment from Greece. And it's at this point that King calls on the US government to sort of get involved and to defend the right of missionaries as American citizens to peacefully reside in Greece. The missionaries had been reluctant to call in the government and call into the State Department precisely because they knew that the US would be sort of wary of getting involved in the workings of a foreign court system from a country that was understood to be a friendly government, which is Greece at this time. They'll have different interpretations about when and how they should intervene in Chinese politics, for example. But they, missionaries, as they were reaching out to the American embassy in London at this point, said that they thought the time had come for the US government to investigate whether King's rights as a US citizen were being infringed and whether his rights of religious liberty were being assailed. President Fillmore at the time was a little unsure about whether or not he wanted to get involved in this situation. He understood correctly, as it turned out, that these two countries were operating with different definitions of religious freedom, and that the missionary attempts to sort of assert an American interpretation of Greek law was inappropriate. But as more and more letters began coming into the State Department in support of King and protesting his treatment by the Greek government, Fillmore changed his mind and sort of authorized Secretary of State Daniel Webster to get involved and to intervene. Now, Webster had previously been celebrated by missionary supporters for his affirmation of missionary citizenship rights in his first term as Secretary of State. He was involved in that Hawaiian case I just mentioned. And so he was very happy to get involved here and to sort of call upon an investigation to go forward. Now, this would be, as it turns out, one of many moments over the course of the century and in the century that would follow, where we see American and foreign definitions of religious freedom coming to a head, as Protestant missionaries insisted that their understanding of the concept was the only legitimate one, and that the US government needed to back them up in this. So what it comes down to here is sort of, what does toleration mean? The Greek Penal Code of 1853 had criminalized reviling and malevolently assailing the doctrines, rites, or customs of any religious sect. So this is how the Greek government was defining toleration. And under that definition, proselytizing was criticism of other religions and thus illicit. But American Protestants had a very different understanding. For King and the missionaries who supported him, it was impossible to explain evangelical Protestantism without, at least sometimes, speaking against the parts of the Orthodox Church that they disagreed with. So logically, they argued, if Protestant missionaries themselves were to be tolerated, then they needed to be able to vocally disagree with the Greek Orthodox Church. And the Greek government disagreed. So to this question, right, Secretary of State Webster sends an American minister at Constantinople, George Perkins Marsh, to come and investigate the Greek law and to understand if the treatment that King had faced was just or fair. What kind of religious toleration is permitted here, and what should the US government do in response? What Webster says here is really, I think, important. and interesting. He tells Marsh, as he's going into the investigation, that missionaries were ambassadors, not sent out by their government, he says, but as the representative for a great number of his fellow citizens. And so missionaries, sort of in this kind of elevated position then, right? They're not just citizens abroad, they're sort of in this somewhat ambassadorial role. They should expect the full support of their government. And so with that instruction and that understanding in mind, this investigation begins. Within weeks, Marsh concludes, indeed, that King had been treated with flagrant injustice and bad faith. He admits the forms of the law were not violated, but the intent and meaning of the law had. Marsh was successful in sort of negotiating a revocation of King's sentence. So King's sort of banishment from Greece was reversed. He was able to return and indeed lived in Greece until his death in 1869. And it's really possible, in fact, really easy to imagine a US government response that would have been really different from this, much less supportive of King in his time of difficulties. This is going to be sort of a landmark moment in mid-century discussions of the rights of Americans abroad, the duties of the US government to protect them. And if King's story then strikes you as odd or problematic, you're not alone. The story of 19th century missionary diplomacy is in part the story of the gradual professionalization of the American diplomatic infrastructure, precisely because of the discomfort that many Americans had with this power that missionaries had to shape US foreign relations. If we want to sort of think about sort of who's uncomfortable with this, we can look at the guy with the mustache in the bottom left of your screen there, William Seward. He was the US minister to China in the second half of the 19th century, and situations like King's were driving him nuts. He was really uncomfortable with sort of how much of his time and of his consul's times was spent dealing with missionaries. He didn't like them personally, and he also really didn't think it was appropriate that missionaries were playing such a big part in sort of the infrastructure of the American position in China. He was particularly embarrassed that by how much the government had to, the US government had to rely on missionary labor in translation efforts and things like this, because the consuls simply weren't getting the kind of training that the missionaries had for linguistic skills and things like this. His ideas would, in fact, become much more dominant over the course of the century, and that's part of what this book explores. Concerns about how missionaries were, not only were missionaries like King sort of arguing about the definition of religious freedom, they were also arguing about provisions in various treaties about where could Americans live and what could they do once they got there, sort of throwing themselves into situations that would then demand the response of people like Seward. Over the course of the century, we'll see sort of some shifting efforts to make the government less reliant on missionary labor, and a lot of growing pains as that happens. So we can think here about these transitions through sort of one more story, and that is the story of Ellen Stone, who's up here on your top left. She's a missionary who's captured in Macedonia in 1901 and held for ransom. It's sort of a moment of nationalist crises in the Ottoman Empire, and she becomes the first major American hostage crisis internationally. My favorite story about her is that she would wear a US flag as part of her dress on the assumption it would grant her protection, because all who saw it would know she was a US citizen and would respect that role, precisely because by the time that she's out in the field in 1901, missionary diplomacy had done a lot of work to ensure that US citizens abroad could trust the US government to step in and protect them, and that foreigners knew that the US government would do so. But she creates this sort of very uncomfortable situation. It is totally unclear to observers at the time why she was taken, what was going on. After the fact, there would be rumors that she was in fact somehow sympathetic with her captors and the nationalist movement that they were believed to be part of. But what we see with her as well is this moment where, at this point, Theodore Roosevelt is president, and he is faced with the question of what should the government do to rescue her? And I will spare you all a Teddy Roosevelt impression here, but he is very, very frustrated by the fact that this woman is out in the field sort of getting herself into challenges. Roosevelt will echo something Seward had said earlier, that Seward's uncle had said earlier throughout the century, this idea that missionaries were taking risks and knew that they were taking risks. And what role should the government be expected to play then in sort of stepping in and saving them from themselves? The US government, Roosevelt knew, simply could not pay the ransom. The mission board was uncomfortable paying the ransom as well. And so this is a very complicated situation in trying to find ways to get her out. Roosevelt would sort of put it this way by 1901, right? When troubles arose, a missionary, he says, has no more right to complain of what may befall him than a soldier has in getting shot. Right? Missionaries know what they're getting themselves into. But the Stone case gives us this challenging example of a moment where it is a woman. And so Roosevelt, in this sort of very gendered understanding of what sort of how women and men ought to be treated differently in these situations, understands that something needs to happen to protect this woman. Now, ultimately, they are able to raise the ransom. Stone's family, she is released and brought home, but she's sort of comes home at a moment of really rethinking then, okay, so what just happened? Where are we in 1901? Why are these missionaries going out around the world and getting into trouble? And what should the US be doing to protect them and to make sure that they are safe, even if they are knowingly sort of taking on risks, going to places where perhaps they're not wanted, perhaps they really sort of have no business of being. And it's that I spend the third part of the book sort of looking at sort of how this transition is sort of playing out in the early 20th century. This section has case studies on the US colony of the Philippines in the aftermath of the wars of 1898, a chapter looking at the Boxer Uprising in China, and so the sort of next couple of years as Americans are really sort of rethinking what the role of the government and missions ought to be. In the Congo, also at this sort of late 19th, early 20th century moment, where we have US missionaries witnessing atrocities and calling on or trying to call on the US government to become much more interventionist in humanitarian disasters around the world. And finally, in the First World War, with a focus on the Armenian genocide and the missionary coordination with the Wilson administration, which is in many ways sort of the culmination of this century of work. Wilson's understandings of internationalism and sort of the US as a moral leader in the world as well, in some ways is the most supportive of the missionary worldview that they're ever going to have. And so we see sort of by the 19-teens and into the 1920s, sort of a moment of transition in global politics, transition in the bureaucracy of the American state, but sort of a mainstream political embodiment of this understanding of missionary diplomacy that has developed over the course of a century. So I'm happy to talk about any and all of this in much more detail. But I'll sort of end here and open it up to questions in the hopes that we'll sort of think more about how these dynamics will grow in the coming decades and the long-lasting implications of this that we are still living with today. Thank you very much.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking us a real tour de force, right, through a century of developments. So we've got, a good 15 minutes for questions, and some of them are already starting to come in.
Fantastic.
to start off, it was great to see um, the example of Ellen Stone. And I think one of the points that you make really nicely, Emily, is about the parity even shifts over time, right? To more women being involved. And
Yes.
I wonder if you might just want to reflect a little on women in statecraft, I guess. And, is it an option actually not to be involved? Are you automatically involved in statecraft by a certain point in time because you're a missionary and because you've embedded yourself in this way?
Mhm.
Or is it possible to opt out? Be like, that's not what I signed up for.
I love this question. Yeah, I mean, what is really striking, well, I should say one thing is this isn't a pretend background behind me. I'm actually here at Yale Divinity School doing some research on precisely this question, which I'm hoping to explore in my next book. But this question of sort of how sort of women missionaries are understood to be part of or not part of this story is, I think, really, really important because after the Civil War, women missionaries dominate the field. Women are more than half of American missionaries, sort of from the beginning of those one mission boards, sort of, I believe, till today. To the best of my knowledge, they are, as soon as the way is open, right, they are running into the breach. And what's really interesting, given that, is that even as we're sort of becoming much more comfortable thinking about how male missionaries are part of diplomatic and political conversations, the assumption, certainly at the time, and I think it sort of filters into the historiography as well, is that women are not part of that story, which strikes me as ridiculous, really. And so there's a couple of moments where this really stands out in the work for missionary diplomacy, Ellen Stone being, of course, the most dramatic example. She insisted after, I said, right, it's not really clear where exactly her sympathies fall in this story, in part because she refused to testify. She, said that the Turkish government has no right to make her. And the understanding there, right, is that she was indeed sympathetic with these nationalists who she never named. And it seems like she did indeed know who they were. Absolutely right. She has a political will of her own and political understandings of what's happening. We see something similar from maybe a slightly different angle where there's at the Ponape mission, there are sort of moment of anti-Spanish colonial conflict there, and the missionaries are sort of being thrown into the mix, and some of the Spanish officials are insisting that missionaries were sort of shaping this and inspiring this anti-colonial movement. And the US government's response is, well, they couldn't possibly have, because look, the only people on the islands at this time were women. And are you really saying that these two women had anything to do with that? And it's this very interesting kind of positionality where you have, I think there's a space for us to sort of think more about what is the relationship between these women missionaries, male missionaries, and how information about the world, how ideas about world politics are being sort of filtered through these sort of gendered assumptions about who is and isn't political.
I love both of those examples. I mean, I think that they're great ones for us to teach with as well as we kind of decenter our expectations. So questions are rolling in. We're up to 13. So let's jump into them. So an anonymous attendee asked, did missionary preparatory schools in the US prepare future missionaries about the likelihood of conflict with governments? Did they inform them, hey, you can call the embassy or the USG if you're in trouble? Did they inform them if they were in was there training, in fact, even before they got to the field, letting them know that they should be seen as ambassadorial figures?
Mm-hmm. This is a fantastic question. There's a lot less training and guidelines than I certainly had expected when I began this work. What we do see is, missionaries are absolutely informed of who they should be reaching out to in case of crisis. That they need a passport is something that is, written into the guidelines of, this is what you need to do to be able to sort of make that claim for citizenship in a very clear way. Here's who the folks on the ground are going to be that you can reach out to. For a lot of, and so in that sense, yes, the idea of sort of this unofficial ambassadorial role, they absolutely are all embracing. One of the things that's really interesting and that I explore in the book here is how they talk, openly and repeatedly about that dynamic and about what is missionary patriotism. They'll use that phrase a lot, and not just during wartime, but to talk about what, how are they balancing themselves as, ambassadors of Christ and ambassadors of the United States. And they are quite proud of themselves going into places where they understand that, people might not have met an American before, and they're going to be sort of shaping those ideas about what the United States is. And I should say that they're thinking about that precisely because they understand, and the State Department doesn't disagree for much of the century, right? That there is this symbiotic relationship that if missions can create sort of a goodwill towards the United States, that's going to open up new opportunities for American trade and American diplomacy and things like that, and vice versa, right? That it's sort of in the interest of both of these, the development of both these movements, if everyone has a good reputation abroad.
Right. Another great question here. So you gave us a shout out for our APCFM collection. Thank you, which is our crown jewels here. So Rick Taylor says, in your earlier years, the ABCFM would have been the largest agency. Its lead missionaries would be expected to have college educations, including scientific knowledge at the time, health understanding, linguistic skills. Over your period, other boards entered the mission work. Did you notice any difference in missionary understandings because of the boards? So I guess our Congregationalists, they hold a higher standard than those Baptists and the Methodists.
Yeah, so this, I will say it is, denominational differences are really interesting here. Most of the groups that that come to be really significant for this missionary diplomacy story are largely, it's the ABCFM, it's the Presbyterians who have a similar kind of understanding of sort of the training and educational backgrounds that they want folks to have. So there's sort of, I guess, two ways to answer this question that I'm sort of puzzling through my brain at once. One is sort of who's reaching out to the State Department, and it's mostly those kind of mainline denominations who are going to be, the men who sort of have the most direct line to the state. But in terms of the missionary intelligence, sort of more broadly, I'm not sure actually, because the understanding here is that sort of your experience on the ground is going to give you sort of this information that other Americans don't have. And so your ability, you've witnessed these places, and right, the linguistic skills also is very much, right, you're learning it on the ground. You're not learning it before you come. Pretty much for this entire period, that's going to be the case. Missionaries it's missionary kids who are going to be developing those area studies programs later and sort of giving more sort of formal education about the world later in the century. For much of this period, you're coming here learning on the ground. And it's that sort of experiential understanding that allows for that sort of sense of, I know better than anyone else.
Maybe to follow that a little, there's a great question from Bob Labadini here about where do the missionary societies end up fitting in this equation? Because I imagine maybe at the start of the story, there's sort of a triangulation, right? Where the US-based society might be as powerful in the work as the State Department, the nascent State Department, and the missionary. But as missionaries become consulates, I mean, what role is the missionary society playing in this? I could see they get cut out of it,
They're sort of your they continue to be really important. And it's especially in moments of crisis and conflict. And I'm sort of doing my hands like this because in my mind, there's this sort of series of letters that are sort of crisscrossing in these really interesting ways. So you'll have, Anderson or Barton at the ABCFM, or Spear, or Brown and the Presbyterians are going to be in really regular contact with DC. And able to sort of have those conversations much more quickly than sort of the folks abroad are going to be. But as when you're talking about like what's happening in China, individual missionaries are talking to the consulates really regularly. And so there's sort of these, I can't think of what the metaphor is, right? But we've got sort of these multiple conversations happening that are sort of individual and personal, sort of in these two different spaces. And then, the missionaries can be writing to Boston or Philly. The consul's gonna be writing to DC. And so there's this interesting kind of trying to, it's a little bit more than triangulation at that point of sort of tracking who's involved. But the societies are really key. And it's in part because the sort of the leaders of those societies are going to sort of inherit that kind of expertise and be able to then take it to political leaders and to this much larger stage. So James Barton of the ABCFM is a great example here. He's a good friend of Woodrow Wilson's. He's going to be like at the center of a lot of those conversations because of what he's able to access from his missionaries abroad. He's then going to be able to bring to the center of power Arthur Judson Brown, whose papers I'm in this week at Yale, is sort of the Presbyterian answer to that. Very much sort of these key figures in sort of embodying all of these, these hundreds and thousands of missionaries around the world. They're sort of claiming all of that knowledge and power and bringing it straight to DC.
That's fantastic. So Kaz Bem, a longtime friend of the library, says, this has been a fantastic talk. It seems like your work is an excellent prequel to David Hollinger's Protestants Abroad about the missionary legacy. And then he asks, and then he states, I hope you're not offended by that comparison.
No, yes. So David Hollinger's work is, of course, huge in this field. And that was very much a framework that at various points in the writing, I was thinking about, is this sort of setting the stage for what David's talking about later? And I think that there's a lot of places of conversation that we sort of in continuity between the two stories. The part of David's work that has always really resonated with what I'm doing here is there's a sort of a part in the discussion of Thailand where one of the former missionaries comes and works for the State Department and sort of shows up and looks in their files and all their information, all the State Department knows about Thailand, he had written when he was a missionary, right? And that's these 20th century legacies continue of the dynamics that I talk about here. I think, if you want to sort of look at the two books side by side, there's, certainly some places where we take different emphases and different angles, particularly on the sort of point of gender that we were talking about before. But there's there's a lot of sort of continuity and looking towards those 20th century implications, right? None of this ends in the, figuring out when to end the book was the really hard thing because it just keeps going, these dynamics.
There's several questions in here about the Armenian genocide, right? Which you have touched on as one of your cases and thinking about this. You want to talk maybe a little bit more about how this story helps us understand the way the US did or did not respond to that genocide? I mean, I know it's a very big question. I know it's not your project, but it feels such like a resonant piece, I think, for our audience.
Yeah. So I think one of the and I'm sort of, as I was sort of scanning through the questions there, right? Some of these sort of focusing in particular on
why did the US not intervene more than it did?
Kinds of intervention, right? And the mission, the missionaries sort of come in, I pick up, most of the chapter focuses on the genocide itself, but there's, of course, this goes back, much longer, and the American missionaries have been in place for a long time. And so by the time that, Barton, in the ABCFM, to sort of center ourselves in those Congregationalists for a little bit longer, he's getting letters from missionaries in the field and friends that are sort of hinting at, right, things are happening again. And he knows what they're talking about precisely because of sort of the 1890s massacres. And this is into the 19-teens, right? This seems to be to the missionaries, right? It's a retread of what they've known before. And one of the really sort of powerful things, I think, for thinking through missionary diplomacy in this case is that by this point, you have sort of a long tradition of the government trusting missionary expertise. Missionaries in multiple times and places by this point have been urging for more humanitarian intervention from the government, and so are sort of comfortable making those arguments. And we've got Wilson in the White House, and so who is very friendly to the mission cause, particularly these Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and really kind of opens the door for missionaries to be involved in the conversation here. And what we see happen then is sort of similar to what happened in the Congo. In this case, we have missionaries and missionary organizations publishing witness accounts of, here is what is happening and here is what we need to do, either as individual citizens who can contribute and help aid in these various ways, or as a government and how it can get involved in the war. One of the things that I think I probably spend a good deal of time in the book focusing on sort of the implications of sort of this sort of humanitarian intervention concern with sort of the state's war policy. And the question there that the Wilson administration is facing, right, is do we declare war on the Ottoman Empire as well when we go into World War I? And the missionaries are very opposed to this, precisely because they are worried that that doing so would kick them out, would put missionaries at risk, and would therefore put Armenians at risk by sort of removing this source of aid. And they are ultimately able to convince the White House that this is the correct move, and make an ultimately, of course, unsuccessful bid for an Armenian mandate after the war. And the argument there is precisely on the grounds that, because of this longstanding American missionary experience, the U.S. has a voice and has a role in this place, and so should continue to do so. Yeah, I can go on at much greater length, but I guess I'll end there.
Well, we have many more questions, but we're out of time. So I will be sharing the rest of the questions with you directly. And thinking specifically about kind of congregational missions to Armenia, there's a researcher was just pointing out this week to us, there's a massive amount in congregational publications coming out of that theme of missionary literature that you start the book with. And that, some of the major congregational magazines have never been digitized. So you really do need to come to the Rare Books libraries to see them. Thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic presentation today. And best of luck researching on the next book.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to see you all.
Take care.